understanding the source of your trauma and understanding what you need to do to recover from that can be two different things. And if you've seen my previous videos, if you watched the channel before, you'll know that I'm not keen on focusing purely on the narcissist and why they do what they do. What I'm keen on, and what the aim of this channel is to make sure that, as a sufferer of narcissistic abuse, that you're able to go through all the stages you need to go through, the 4 stages I would describe them, in order to resolve that toxic relationship. Now, there's an important part of that is understanding the narcissist, but I would say the key part of that is it's in the early stages. If you're not sure what narcissistic personality disorder is, if you're just coming into understanding what this condition is, it's extremely important to know what you're dealing with in order to come to the conclusions that you need to come to, whether that's exiting that relationship or making the decision to try and resolve it. But post that, really it's about how you exit that relationship and how you go on to recover from the trauma that's been done to you. And one of the things that's become clear to me, and it's something that I've mentioned in the previous videos, I definitely came out of my narcissistic relationship suffering with symptoms of PTSD. And recently I was watching a video from Richard Grannon and having a conversation with one of my viewers that got me thinking about kind of PTSD and also complex PTSD, and I'll go into both of those in a little bit in a second. But really that there's a danger that a lot of us that are suffering from narcissistic abuse are trying to solve things like PTSD by understanding the root cause of that PTSD, and I'm not sure that that's the right approach to take. Now, as mentioned before, I'm not a professional, I'm not an expert, but I'll give a little description of what I think the difference is between PTSD and complex PTSD. But Richard Grannon had also done a video of this recently, and I'll put a description in the description box below. I'll put a link in there to take you to that video, because I think he'll do a much better job of explaining it than I can. But in a very simplistic, oversimplified view, effectively, PTSD is really a mapping of symptoms to a single cause, a single event or events that are very clearly traumatic for you, that leave you with symptoms afterwards. So, event like, for example, a car crash happens, a very common thing that, resulted in significant trauma for someone. And afterwards, stimuli that reminded of that event, things like tire screeching, the sound of engines revving, whatever it is, can bring on memories of that traumatic event and repeat symptoms. So it's a very clear relationship between the event and the symptom afterwards. With complex PTSD, I believe it comes from a much more unpredictable, kind of a longer term, slightly lower key series of traumatic events that your mind struggles to map back to the original event. And that's very typical with narcissistic abuse, in that the abuse you suffer isn't related to a specific behavior, a specific event that you've enacted. So abuse can come randomly, it can come at any time, it can come at any severity, and it can be continuous, and it leaves you in an unpredictable state while you're going through it, of not quite knowing how to behave, and that can be very traumatic in itself. And afterwards, what it can leave you with, I believe, is a mind that is unsure what actually caused the trauma in the first place. So is almost overreacting, has mapped a series of events, a series of stimulus that could potentially cause trauma to that trauma. So you end up in a situation where things like a certain smell might trigger you off for no reason, because it may have been around a time of a traumatic event for you. And the key difference with both of those things is, I think with PTSD, although it's likely to be difficult to recover from, although it's very possible, it's fairly clear to understand what's causing it and diagnose the source of it. With complex PTSD, I believe it's much more difficult, and almost the approach to it, I think, is not to try and understand the root cause of it, not try and understand the event, because ultimately there isn't really a singular event. It's really just to try and remap those associations positively in general, and try and kind of rewire your brain to disassociate any of that kind of stimulus that's not correct with the symptoms you're feeling. And it's worth considering as well that there's a strong theory out there that actually narcissistic personality disorder is just a form of complex PTSD, in that narcissists develop because they grow up in environments where love and abuse are given kind of sparingly and unpredictably and mixed together. So the child, the developing brain is unsure when to expect or how to behave. to either avoid abuse or receive love. So they end up developing traits to try and control that, to make it predictable and to try and map that out in a much better way, which again results in a poor mapping and poor behavior to try and make both of those things predictable. So the source of what we're going through, I guess, and what narcissists go through is fairly similar. And that can kind of give you some insight into how that condition develops and also kind of what it can do to you in the long term. Now, PTSD and particularly complex PTSD are fascinating to me for two reasons. One is I think I've suffered from them and to an extent still do suffer from them. So I'm still going through some of my own work to try and remap my own kind of mind and my own associations. But also I've got and always have had a huge fascination in operant conditioning. And if you're not sure what operant conditioning is, it's a kind of behavioral technique that's based on kind of behavior and reward or behavior and punishment. So you've probably come across it if you're used to any kind of dog training, and this is where really I came across it. I've always had dogs throughout my life, and operant conditioning plays a big part in kind of driving dog behavior. The classic example of a dog does a behavior that you want, it displays behavior that you ask it to, so like sitting, and it gets rewarded positively with some food, and the proximity of the reward to the original behavior helps strengthen and reinforce that behavior is wanted and rewarded, so it gives positive reinforcement. There's also the reverse of that, where a behavior that isn't wanted is displayed and receives positive punishment. So effectively they perform an act, you don't want it, and they get punishment in the form of a correction physically or whatever it is, a psychological reaction. And without going down a rabbit hole, that's very kind of shunned on in the dog world. So it is a form of behavioural kind of modification. And without going into too much detail, you've also within that got negative reinforcement and negative punishment, which is kind of the converse, where things are taken away, stimulus is taken away when certain behaviours are kind of displayed. But that's not really that relevant. The key point I wanted to make with it is if you're interested in it, I think this plays a key part in how PTSD and complex PTSD is developed. So I'll try and put a link to it in the description box as well. The father, or the considered father of operant conditioning, is a guy named B.F. Skinner. And as part of his experiments in operant conditioning, he actually performed experiments with pigeons on trying to kind of establish human superstition. And the principle behind it was to provide rewards for pigeons in the form of food that were given at kind of random times, so non-predictable times. And what he observed over time was that as the pigeons that were given rewards at random times, they started to develop kind of the behaviour of trying to repeat kind of the particular behaviour that they were displaying at the time of the reward. So things like bowing their head, scraping the floor. So in just purely coincidentally, if twice they've weaved their head or bowed their head and a reward was given on a random schedule, their mind started to associate that particular behaviour with positive reward. And there's a strong theory there that kind of randomness and that drives what we see in superstition in people, possibly even religion, but that's a whole kind of bigger topic in itself. But things like people believing in luck, people believing that if they do certain things that bad things won't happen. There's a theory out there that was proposed, a hypothesis that comes from effectively kind of random operant conditioning, random rewards given. And that, in the form of complex PTSD, I think there's a key part to play in that as the abuse that you suffer as a victim of narcissistic abuse is very random and not from any real act or behaviour that you've displayed yourself, it leads you to a condition where your mind is trying to make associations that aren't really there. And in the case of complex PTSD and narcissistic kind of abuse, what we're left with, I think that random operant conditioning, that random punishment as it would be, is what leads us to have complex PTSD. That the unpredictable nature, the random nature of the abuse we suffer in terms of both frequency and severity of the abuse, I think leads the mind to struggle to make the association, which it naturally tries to do. I think the human brain, the mammalian brains either generally try to associate certain behaviours with certain kind of rewards or punishments. And it's natural to try and say, well, if I got punished here, if I received abuse, what did I do before that led to it? And not being able to map those things together, I think, plays a huge part in effectively leading us to have all kinds of complex PTSD symptoms. But the important point to make with this is that if I'm correct and that recovering from CPTSD is an act of remapping and reassociation in the brain, then focusing on the source of the trauma, on the narcissist, the person that caused you the abuse in the first place, isn't going to help, and actually may continue to trigger the stimulus that is leading to the symptoms you're experiencing now. So the whole summary of this video really is, again, something I focus on in a lot of videos, is while there is use in understanding the narcissist and why they do what they do, it's not the key to recovering once you've left that narcissist, once you've exited that relationship. It doesn't really serve a purpose in helping you recover and become a healthy human being. What I think the key things to focus on are overcoming PTSD and symptoms like that, reassociating your brain, and also making sure you're working on your boundaries, making sure you're working on your own codependency issues so that you don't get back into that situation in the first place. And ultimately, the answer to why you were abused in the first place really is that you just met someone who was damaged and had really poor coping mechanisms. And you can spend hours and hours and days and years, you could probably spend the rest of your life trying to understand and diagnose the source of narcissistic personality disorder and try and kind of work out the ins and outs of it, but ultimately it doesn't help you get to where you need to get to. And it's an important thing to realize that if, like me and the viewer that I was having the conversation with, you find yourself trying to control things around your environment, you have to understand that while control might feel safe, control isn't healing. And actually focusing on that narcissist, focusing on what happened, is really just another form of kind of almost obsessive controlling behavior. It's trying to almost kind of see the threat that's coming over the horizon, to sort of revisit it and make sure that you're kind of still aware of it. But it will keep you trapped in that loop, and it won't allow you to kind of go and progress. And actually the answer is really to try and expand your horizons, to try and reassociate things, to try and broaden those horizons out, and keep the relative safety, keep the aspects of your environment that are healthy to keep safe, but don't try and control it all. And ultimately, you could spend the rest of your life with locked doors and locked windows and not going out the house, and on one hand you'll be fairly convinced that nothing will ever kill you, but on the other hand you won't be living either. And that's kind of where I would try and focus on, is making sure that your journey doesn't just end when you exit a narcissistic relationship. The journey really ends when you're healthy, happy, and you have correct boundaries in place and you're able to live a happy life.